Okay, we'll begin now, and as we wait for people to join. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Nata Devori, and I'm Director of the Center for Global Women Studies and co-leader of the Gender and Public Policy Research Cluster in the Whitaker Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on Engendering the Macroeconomy, Current Efforts and Future Directions, and look forward to a rich and engaging discussion. A few ground rules set first. We will have time for Q&A as well as comments from the audience. Please use the Q&A box to type in your questions. If you would like to verbally ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand and we will unmute you. I'm pleased to welcome two distinguished speakers in today's webinar, Professor Maria Floro and Dr. Srinivasan Raghavendran. Maria Floro is Professor of Economics and co-director of the Program on Gender Analysis in Economics at American University in Washington, D.C. Her publications include co-authored books on informal credit markets and the new institutional economics, women's work in the world economy, and gender development and globalization, economics as if all people mattered, and various articles on time use, care work, and unpaid work, gender and vulnerability, urban food security, poverty, ecological crisis, household savings, credit, and informal employment. The list is long. Dr. Floro currently leads the Care, Work, and Economy project funded by Hewlett Foundation. Srinivasan Raghavendran is lecturer in economics, co-PI of the recently concluded DFID-funded project on economic and social costs of violence against women and girls, and is also a member of the research network for the Care Economy and Economy project. A macroeconomist with extensive research on financialization and redistribution, he has been recently working on the broad field of engendering macroeconomics, focusing on integrating the issue of violence against women and unpaid care work in macroeconomic models. His publications in this field include several journal articles in the Feminist Economics Journal on the issue of violence against women and care work and the macroeconomy, a commissioned discussion paper for the World Bank on intimate partner violence, and a working paper on the implications of violence against women for growth in the Levy Economics Institute working paper series. You're both very welcome to this webinar. And we look forward to hearing from you. Before we begin, I wish to make one observation. Today is International Women's Day, a day to celebrate the advances made on gender equality and the rights of working women. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has sharply highlighted the continued stranglehold of patriarchal norms, with women facing disproportionately the pandemic's negative impacts, particularly in terms of the burden of care work and violence against women, including domestic violence. The conversation today is very timely as we consider the way forward from this global pandemic and address the entrenched inequalities that the crisis has illuminated. To begin, I would like to first ask both of you, why is engendering the macroeconomy important to do? In your opinion, what does it entail? Professor Floro, would you like to begin?
Thank you very much, Nata, and thank you for the organizers of this webinar. I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation. For me, it's important because, simply put, it makes us truly achieve gender equality, and in particular to inform the policy discourse on the ways that these can be addressed in a full sense by integrating gender in the policy tools. You see, for me, an important objective is to strive for a society that's more gender equitable. And all of us, I think, believe that economic growth should be inclusive, well, for many of us anyway, and sustainable. But in order to do that, we have to reduce the male bias and gender blindness in analytical frameworks that profoundly influence policymaking. And to do this, we have to ensure that women's experiences, voice, and economic contributions are fully reflected in the tools used in macro policymaking. The way I see it is if there is still, even though macroeconomic policies influence profoundly policymaking, many standard macroeconomic models still avoid addressing the gender dimensions, or if they do, there is still a lack of understanding in a deep sense on how gender relations can permeate all levels of economic life. As you have pointed out, Nata, the pandemic helped unravel these gender differentiated ways in which the crisis affected women and men as workers, parents, caregivers. It reveals also, in my view, the fundamental interdependence between the market economy, which is often measured and the focus of much discussion in macro policy discourses, and the care economy, much of which rely on unpaid labor of family members, particularly those provided by women. So if we take this care economy for granted, assuming that it can and will always function no matter what, you are blindsiding the true objective of gender equality and miss the point of an inclusive and sustainable growth. Maybe I'll let Raghav mention this before I talk about what it entails.
Raghav, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Firstly, I wanted to say that greatly honored to be talking with Professor Maria Floro and Dr. Dury, who are pioneers in their own work, as well as pushing the frontiers in feminist economics. So I'm talking from a perspective where I'm coming from a macroeconomics background. What engendering macroeconomics means is about integrating women's contribution at home and to wider society in the circuit of market production. Women's work at home, that includes unpaid care work, caring for children, elderly, and others, is a critical input in the reproduction of market labor, both in the short term and in the long term, and should be part of the circuit of production or national income, simply put. Macroeconomics growth literature underscores the importance of labor productivity, human capital for growth and development. But it does not go beyond and incorporate unpaid care work in both short and long term that are integral inputs into both labor productivity and human capital. Somehow these models seems to assume both productivity and human capital are exogenous to growth and development, and that the socio-cultural processes that determine these factors are unimportant. The gender blindness of macroeconomic models reflect in the recovery policies after every crisis. We have experienced so many market crashes, crises, recessions, now the pandemic. In all these crises, the common element is that women have suffered more, be it in juggling market work or household unpaid care work, or through higher levels of intimate partner violence. Ironically, this pandemic has put a spotlight on the endemic of violence against women, as well as the disproportionate burden women carry in terms of household caring work. It's not that only during this crisis violence has increased or women's disproportionate burden of care has increased. It has always been there. Only we don't see, or we never saw, or we didn't care to see. So I will leave it here for the entire discussion to come.
Nata, do you mind if I add a little bit about what it entails, just to continue our the points
yes, of course.
raised by Raghav? So in other words, the first thing one has to do is really to broaden the scope of the economy. If we have to inquire what, the sort of how can we achieve, better human well-being and attain higher quality of life, we need to broaden that scope of the economy. And that it should encompass all economic activities that are involved in human provisioning. And that includes the non-market sector or the care economy. So that's really what it takes if we want to put people in the center of development. But also the other thing is the micro foundations of the macroeconomy. What is our conceptualization of human nature? How do we characterize people's behavior and decision making? And what's our concept of society? Rather than just simply making, let's say, a macroeconomic model be based on simply an agglomeration of millions of so-called autonomous rational people or persons, individuals, who make rational choices that underlie the operations of markets. We want a gender-aware macroeconomy that takes into account that individuals are multifaceted people. They're both autonomous, independent, they're self-interested, but they're also caring. They are imbued with reason as well as with emotion. And that reasoning, by the way, can be influenced by other people's behavior, by social norms. There is competition, but there's also cooperation and collaboration. I think we need to rethink also the micro foundations of what the macroeconomy is about.
Yeah. To continue that, as I said, we have seen so many crises, and in all these crises, macroeconomic policies, recovery policies, have been exclusively concentrated on the economy itself. We talked about tax, credit supply, labor, capital market policies to incentivize firms, innovation, banks, production sectors, etc., to adapt and innovate at a higher level. We also talked about market reforms, labor market and capital markets. However, we failed to go beyond the proximate causes of growth and see how unpaid care and social reproduction at homes in the community are the ultimate adjusting variables that underpins the effectiveness of these policies and bring back growth. The cumulative impact of ignoring the social reproduction in all the past crises is what is playing out in this crisis. Had we strengthened and consolidated the care and reproduction in the past, we might have seen a better cushion in this crisis, but that's not to be. So ignoring the issue of care and social reproduction again in this crisis would be a huge mistake. And we have been crossing the same river many times over. So a complete rethink, of macroeconomics is what needed. Not just tinkering around the edges by using a gender-blind model and adding another gender variable and calibrating with real data to generate some inclusive or equitable scenarios for policymaking. This has to be a complete new way of thinking, a more gender-sensitive way of thinking, where governments should, create and strengthen the care and reproduction sector. Every crisis we have looked at economy. Now, I think it's time to look at the social side of it, the care and reproduction sector, independent of the healthcare expenditure that we're making.
That's actually an extremely important point. So what you're both saying is that we really need to rethink, recast, and focus on what are our fundamental values and what is the purpose of the economy. Is it for endless growth or is it for well-being? And if it's for well-being, then what are the different dimensions we should be considering? So what you've suggested is that it's quite a broad and big project to engender the macroeconomy. So could you give us a sense of what have been some of your own specific efforts in this field? Maria, can you talk about your work?
Well, until recently, my own research for the most part has been on the development of gender-aware micro-foundations of macroeconomic analysis. In the past 30 years, I've been working on unpaid work and trying to see how we can value and capture care labor so that it can be integrated in macroeconomic analysis. So my work has been on that area. But that said, I am privileged to have been part of a collective endeavor to engender macroeconomics that goes way back to the 1990s. I'd like to acknowledge here the seminal work on gender and macro that were produced by the so-called International Working Group on Gender, International Economics, and Macroeconomics that were led by the early pioneers in this area, Nilofer Chatay, Diane Elson, Karen Groen, and others, which have also since produced regional networks in Asia Pacific, Latin America, and Africa region. But the current collaborative effort that I am part of is the so-called Care, Work, and the Economy project that you have mentioned earlier in the introduction. In this project, we develop ways in which, in an innovative way, in which we can integrate care and other gender dimensions into macroeconomic analysis. The focus of our project is really the care economy, which underpins the functioning of the economy. And so what we have done here is we want to is to come up with ways in which care can be integrated in a manner that is meaningful and not just sort of add women and stir approach, so that we could reduce the gender gaps and in economic outcomes and promote a sustainable growth and development. You see, in my view, the neglect of care in key policy tools, such as macroeconomic models, has led to the neglect of addressing care needs in a very comprehensive manner, including in this country, the United States, where I am. As a result, we have an emerging care crisis that's already pointed out by Raghav, but I want to emphasize that it's manifested not only in the pandemic, the number of people who are sick, but also in the form of uncared elderly, disabled, the sick, and children society. This crisis has also taken the form of silent protests against long unpaid work hours performed by women, leading to decline in marriage rates, in fertility rates way below the replacement level, that have serious short-term and longer-term consequences, including the shrinking of our labor supply. And of course, that leads to what we call the crisis in social reproduction. So the community of more than 35 scholars around the world that's part of this Care, Work, and the Economy project has really sort of pushing the boundaries of knowledge, in my view. We have, some of these models have been applied in a country that has industrialized and grew very rapidly in the 70s and 80s, but it's witnessing a rapid demographic change in both declining very low fertility rates and increasing life expectancies, and that's South Korea. So we want to demonstrate the policy lessons that a care-focused macroeconomic model can reveal by illustrating how a care-embedded, macroeconomic models can allow us to understand the gendered outcomes, but also the distributional consequences of macroeconomic policies. So I'd like, and I hope that this endeavor in our project will continue. I think right now, I see that there are many other gender and macro projects that are being put together or that are doing really innovative work in other parts of the world. But I think that we are going in the right direction, in my view.
Yeah, thank you. I want to say first, I want to say that my main area is macroeconomics, but I've been inspired and by so many feminist economists who have pushed boundaries in this field of economics, and I stand on the shoulders of those giants. My interest in my main areas, as Nata said before, are violence against women and unpaid care work. I was always interested in these issues right from my childhood, having brought up in a society that worship women as gods and denigrate women at all times. The contradiction regarding the status of women has always troubled me and still troubles me. The violence against women work has been going on for some time. The aim is to see if one can see how does violence against women manifest at a macroeconomic level. After all, violence impacts productivity, right? Productivity laws, which is borne out by your own by Nata's own seminal work in this field, shows that people economy loses a lot of money individually as a community to productivity loss. And as macroeconomists, we know that ultimately economic growth is driven by productivity and human capital. So using some of the field surveys Nata and her co-researchers conducted in many parts of the world, Vietnam, Ghana, Pakistan, South Sudan, we began to look at the macroeconomic impact. So using the data from Vietnam and Ghana and other countries, we show that the loss to the economy as a whole, or what we call as macroeconomic loss, is about 0.9 to 1% of GDP. This is only taking into account the impact of interpersonal violence that led to absenteeism in the post-violent episodes. We did not account for so many other issues like psychological dimensions of violence and the medium to long-term impact on skills and capabilities. So while doing this violence work from the field study data, I also looked at listened to the qualitative interview data that's been discussed by Nata and the group. I clearly saw the connection between violence and unpaid care work. That motivated me to pursue the issue of unpaid care work again from a macroeconomics perspective. Women who are gone through violence, they don't shrink their responsibilities in terms of so-called responsibilities in terms of caring for children and elderly. They actually cut down their self-care time to actually tend to family work, even though they are hurt and physically hurt and they're unable to move. This is an important issue, I thought, which needs to be integrated into macroeconomic model. And as I said, I worked in macroeconomic, kind of heterodox macro models, which talks about class struggle in capitalist democracies. And I was quite interested in looking at the intersection of class and gender by looking at, what underpins the class conflict or cooperation between two classes. And along with Rama Vasudevan and in Colorado State University, we have just submitted a paper that again looks at the issue of inclusive development policies that promote self-employment and financial inclusion from the unpaid care perspective. These are my broad areas of work. In terms of whether people have recognized this work within the field or not, it's very slow, to be honest, both in the mainstream as well as in the heterodox. Engendering macroeconomics has not picked up yet.
So just taking off from that, what would you say are some of the really conceptual and technical challenges in trying to do the work that you've been doing? So Raghav, would you like to,
yeah.
You're trying to advance theory and not just only creating some estimates of loss of productivity. So
yeah, first of all, as John Maynard Keynes said long time ago, it's easy to see new ideas, but it is always a struggle to escape from old ways of thinking. And these old ways of thinking is, it's your own upbringing, socio-cultural upbringing, which has ingrained in me the notions of masculinity. That the most basic layer that creates the greatest of all barriers. And second, economics as a discipline does not help in getting out of such barriers as well. The notions of masculinity in many different ways defines and shapes one's ideas about research problems and research agendas. So if you are able to escape that and work on gender-related issue, then there is a social pressure in the community is another stumbling block because it's seen outside the mainstream work. So one goes through rejection, indifference, opposition, and so on. And if you can survive all that, then only you can seriously begin to think about the conceptual problems of how do you integrate gender. And you still have there are barriers like ideological nets. So in my own work, what I've been trying to do for the past number of years is to, either look at the gender relation within the class relation. I mean, that's been my struggle. I have been struggling with it. It's not easy. I think I've gotten somewhere to it because how do I incorporate horizontal inequalities in a class conflict model and to actually articulate or hypothesize about beneath this class conflict and cooperation between, let's say, workers and capitalists, there is this, gender element, or let's say unpaid care work that actually forms the underlying layer that actually defines the limits to cooperation and conflict in a capitalist economy. That's been a massive challenge. I'm still working at it. These are some of the conceptual and methodological and the socio-cultural barriers that I actually have faced so far.
And Maria, would you like to add to that?
Yes, as a microeconomist, a feminist microeconomist, it's really interesting and a really good learning experience for me to interact with the macroeconomists in our project, especially the leading pioneers on gender and macro, including Stephanie Seguino, Elisa Bronstein, Nancy Fulbray, James Oslim, James Hines, Oslim Onaran, Ipek, Ilkarakan, Ajit Zacharias, Marcia Fontana, and many others who have been amazingly innovative. But as a microeconomist, I understand very deeply the gender dimensions, say in household dynamics or in labor markets and the trade-off, especially for women. I work on time use data between the time they spend in doing work and time they spend doing the domestic chores and caring for the children and the frail elderly. And now we see that in the pandemic that, women can't do both. It's so difficult and it has been heart-wrenching for many to make certain hard choices. But that has been the case for many women in the informal sector, in the home-based workers, for example. So that said, I see the conceptual challenges in terms of, in my interaction with the macroeconomists. Well, how do you integrate household dynamics in the macroeconomic model that is tractable? That doesn't confuse and make it explode, so to speak, right? How do you, for example, in my conversation with Raghav, how do you combine the real and financial sectors of the economy that still allow gender relations that pervade many levels of economic life to be captured and still allow the macroeconomic model to be simple and be able to and tractable? And then in my conversation with macroeconomists who's developing now the gender care embedded computable general equilibrium model, what are the meaningful sectoral categories and a manner of disaggregating the macroeconomy in a way that will capture the linkages, the critical linkages between market and non-market activities? I also see the challenge and how macroeconomic analysis can reveal, well, the so-called hidden, non-monetized social costs that may entail long-term losses. So these are the kind of challenges that I think we still face and we're continuing to address. At the technical level, I would say we need better data that adequately capture and measure unpaid care. I mean, I've been working on time use surveys for the last 30 years, and it exists now in more than 80 countries. But in integrating it in the macroeconomic model, one realized that we are still not able to capture the extent and the intensity of care work, including frail elderly. I mean, when we were working even on very good time use survey data, the information on elder care is minuscule. It's not somehow captured. And I think time use researchers can tell us why, and also the feminists can tell us why that may be the case. And also statistics such as wages and other types of earnings have yet to be gender disaggregated. We still have to be able to identify and for example, in our labor force, who in our labor force are paid care substitutes, such as childcare workers and elder care workers. It's not easy because the design of labor force surveys, household surveys, firm surveys tend to miss the importance of the, sort of the gender dimensions of where this data is going to be used. So anyway, those I think are some of the challenges that we continue to face, but I'm very hopeful that many of the people working on our project, but as well as in other projects on care and on gender and macroeconomy will come up with innovative and creative ideas.
Can I just add to that? If I can? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, the heterodox models, the challenges that we have, but there are also challenges in the mainstream models, where particularly with the rational agent approach in the current macroeconomic policy models, it actually does not matter whether you have a man or a woman as long as you have an optimizing agent, right, in those models. But to start with, seeing women's work at home as an optimizing behavior itself is quite problematic. In large parts, there is altruism. I grew up in a society where, women simply can't even think about themselves in a selfish way. They have given up their entire lives for their families, taking all forms of abuse and violence for the sake of children and larger family. So one cannot even begin to think about delineating the lines that separate selfless love and a sense of duty that they feel towards their families. So to reduce such a complex feeling to an optimizing behavior is simply very, very challenging. Therefore, rethinking must start at this level to liberate the household from the rationalist model and to start with slightly more realistic description of the underlying power dynamic that actually that we see in capitalist democracies.
Yeah, I think that's also a very important point. And it makes us also think through. I mean, feminist economics has moved forward in terms of collective bargaining models, so that there's trying to address some of the underlying power dynamics. But there's been also, to what extent have we really developed models of cooperation, which is important. And this leads me to my final question, which is really about, as we consider the moving forward from the pandemic, do you feel we can move towards more inclusive macroeconomic models, not just gender, but race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability? Because what we are seeing is there are different axes of inequalities that interact. So, can we have a model that is actually all inclusive? Or is that a pie in the sky dream?
Um, yeah, I think I can, if I, or I can leave it to Maria.
Yes and no, in my view. I think, you know, I see now so much creativity and innovation of our feminist macroeconomists, those in the Care Work and the Economy project and in other projects. So I see that there's hope, but for sure the challenge is to really make macroeconomics truly a part of social science. It is a social science, it's not physical science. It's about people's behavior, people's interaction with others. And it's not just captured in the so-called market exchange, that there are many dimensions of people, but how to capture it in a meaningful way that focus not only in the overall aggregate outcomes. I know that macroeconomic models tend to sort of say, okay, we want to see the big picture. We want to see the entire forest rather than the individual trees. Well, in my view, you cannot separate the forest or, for example, the state of health of the forest from the state of health of the individual trees that make up that forest. So if we want to talk about inclusive growth, sustainable growth, in terms of GDP per capita, we need to also take into account the distributional and welfare consequences. Who benefits and who gets to be burdened by cost, monetized as well as non-monetized costs. Economic costs in the short run as well as social costs in the long run. And I think that's where, in my view, the macroeconomics ought to be going. And it is this integration of gender, race, class, sexual orientation, all of this should not be done in a knee-jerk fashion. I think what we tend to happen is that the crisis for, unravel, this hidden aspect or invisible aspect of the economy, such as the care economy, and then, policymakers address it because they need to, right? And society are aware of it, but then unless there is a recasting, as pointed out by Raghav, a transformation of how we think about, what the role of economics as a social science discipline ought to be, and what is the purpose of this of economics? What is the goal that it should strive for? And unless we recast it and rethink it, we won't be able to move forward in integrating all of these dimensions. we have to ask. I think what the feminist economists have been doing has been asking irritating questions. I mean, they've been doing that. I have wonderful mentors who made me where I am, and I learned so much from them because they ask irritating questions in the American Economics Association meetings, in discussions with the policymakers. But these irritating questions make people think like me. I mean, and it makes also people, including policymakers, think as what's missing in the tools that they have been using in developing policies. And I think we need to keep on pushing that.
Yeah, for me, it's, as a true macroeconomist would say, it depends. It depends on what aspects of various horizontal inequalities one is trying to incorporate. But it is a huge challenge of bringing in horizontal and vertical inequalities defined by class, caste, race, gender. It's not very it's not simple to think even. See, from a policy perspective, what I do think is, it will, as Keynes said, it takes a long time to escape from your old ways of thinking. And these old ways of thinking are defined by patriarchy, which has been there for a long time and will be there for a long time. But in a kind of in an immediate scenario where one is thinking about post-COVID and this kind of crisis, every crisis, macroeconomists always argue about the shape of the recovery, V shape or K shape, some feared W shape in 2008, and so on and so forth. But you see, I think it's quite important to, at this point in time, think about how do we address this issue of get the crisis policies for the post-crisis world. I believe, to sustain, it has to be sustained development of a public provisioning of care. And it's not just about, looking at a care as on its own, care and self-reproduction on its own, but you also have to think about economic viability of this. If you were to talk about social provisioning of care as well as social reproduction, you have to link different issues. You have to see this in a holistic perspective. You cannot just invest in care and inclusive or social reproduction on its own. You have to link it to domestic violence. You have to invest in domestic violence services. As we know, the loss to domestic violence to the economy is about 0.9 to 1% of GDP. The savings that we are making, if we reduce the violence, is about 1% of GDP. That actually, to some extent, funds the development of public provisioning of care, and also connecting the employment guarantee schemes that we have in many of the developing countries exclusively in the care sector would also help. So one has to think about not just automatic stabilizer in the terms of income support to families, but also automatic social stabilizer or care stabilizer that actually gives care services in the community and increases the reliance of resilience of communities and economies in the times of crisis. So the cumulative impact of reduced violence for a long time can actually pay for this sector in the long run, increased productivity, potential output, and growth. So whether there are two issues, one, whether you actually change macroeconomics or not, the other issue is about the policies. Can we actually think about policies, since we don't have, it will take a long time to develop, a completely intersectional macroeconomics. But now, for the current needs of our society, if we go back to, again, the same way of doing tax credit and increased infrastructure spending and so on, without looking at this care and social reproduction issues, we will be crossing the same river many times over.
And if I may add, the points raised, very eloquently by Raghav also point to how we should address the climate crisis, the climate change issue. It really requires all of us to think, and it won't be just a matter of correcting the market mechanism. This is really what has been much the focus of policies. We need to think beyond correcting market mechanism. And I think that's very important if we have to address, both the care crisis that's emerging, that's already unraveling, as well as the climate crisis. And of course, the increasing, the persistence of violence against women that remain invisible for the most part in policy making.
Thank you very much, both of you. It's really profound discussion that we've been having. And I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions. So let's move to the Q&A part of the webinar. There are right now 4 questions. I would also like to again say, if anyone wants to verbally raise a question or make a point or give a comment, please raise your hand and we will unmute you. So let me first start with the questions that have been put. The first is from Su Ming Ku, who says that her question relates to a change in baseline assumptions. Until the 1980s, it was generally assumed that there would be a reduction in economic inequalities in the long term, as both low pay would be moderated by better minimum wages and increasing higher education would spread the benefits at the top of the distribution. But these assumptions are no longer in place since overall inequalities have been increasing, not decreasing. How do you think this general invalidation of assumed secular trends affect the possibilities to reduce inequalities of violence and care as macroeconomic concerns? I think that that's quite a complicated and heavy question. So let's first have both. Who would like to take this first?
I'll start the conversation here. I think the way the way since the 1980s, where much of the focus has been to sort of correcting the market by deregulation, by liberalization of the markets, okay, en blanc, with not taking into account the social longer term and economic consequences of these policies, has led to a set of policies, in the labor, in macroeconomic policies that sort of disregard the distributional consequences of these policies. Now, the recent attempts, especially in the United States, where I am, to sort of push for higher minimum wage law is a good step in direction, but it still has to address the fundamental sources and causes of the structural, in my view, of inequality. And unless we understand the various phases of that inequality, that it takes the form of gender inequality, racial inequality, class inequality, it's going to be what I call a knee-jerk fragmented approach to addressing inequality. What is needed here, if we truly want to address economic and social inequality, is what we call the big push. I mean, way back in the 50s and 60s, when there was a big push, it requires a comprehensive approach. But that means sort of changing, as you said, when you talk about baseline, looking also at what our underlying assumptions are. Would so-called economic growth trickle down and benefit everybody ultimately? And that has been, for example, the answer for many years, that eventually, if we just pursue economic growth altogether, society, everybody in a given economy or society is going to benefit. Well, we know that's not happening, and we know that for a long time. And I think the pandemic, and I think the ecological crisis, the climate crisis that we are now seeing, says that no, there are people who are very vulnerable, who are likely to be the first to shoulder the burden and cost. And I think that's the point that Raghav was saying, that also we need to recast how we think about how the economy ought to function and what is the ultimate goal. We should not mix up the means and the end. And I think we've been focusing so much in the means, i.e., let's increase the production of material goods and services so that people will consume more on the aggregate. But that in fact also has a backlash now in our environment, in our ecosystem. So we have to rethink about that as well. You know, what's the impact of our ways of producing and consuming is going to impact the next generation, let alone other people in our society that are at the margins or are excluded from benefiting from that. And that even education is an important tool in, for example, achieving gender equality. There's no question about that, but it is not a sufficient. It requires more than that. I'm going to be educated, but if, for example, in people in India or in some people in different parts of the world, but then I see myself as a role as a good mother and a good wife, and that's my primary role. And so, you know, education has to lead to promoting girls' education, and gender equality in education is an important and necessary, but not, in my view, sufficient to achieve gender equality.
Thank you. Raghav, do you want to add anything?
Just to add that, see, every science, if it adapts and adjusts to the current situation or reality. So the baseline, we know that baseline is not working for many years, as your question itself, you talk about inequality. We know that austerity policy, feminist economists have been pushing this for a long time, since 1980s, structural adjustment policies, in the context of structural adjustment policies, the austerity that has taken place in developing countries and in the developing world in post 2007, 2008 crisis, we have seen increased casualization of labor force, increased discrimination against women, and so on and so forth. We have seen, but if we talk about gender as a category, within that, you have Black women suffering more in terms of India, lower caste women suffering more. So there is a disproportionate burden on women in different segments of this population. So this, if we don't take this into account, well, we can't take this account, because in macroeconomic data, there is not much data, as Professor Maria Sergio is talking about. The data is still not there, because it's not identified as data in the macroeconomic models. So we are in a catch-22 situation, that the macro models or the current economic thinking doesn't think that women's, let's say, violence against women or gender inequality is part of an economic output or economic production. So it's not in the data. So without data, we don't have evidence. Without evidence, we're not going to push the baseline anyway. So baseline continues. So that's I think is one of the issues that I thought I will raise it at this point for the question.
Okay, thank you. There is one Maria Helen Deo who would like to ask a question. Helen, can you unmute? I've given you permission to speak. Yes. Helen, please go ahead.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes. We can hear you. Maria, would you like to go ahead? Maybe while you're having maybe technical difficulties, I'll move to the next comment that came in the Q&A while you sort out the technical issues. John Maher has said that interdisciplinary perspectives which recognize social influences, power structures, counting and accounting, as well as incentives, bounded rationality, and distribution of society's wealth will all help unravel a more simplistic stovepipe analysis. I think this is very much in line with what you have been saying. Would you like to respond to that comment?
What was the last phrase? Stovepipe? What?
Stovepipe analysis.
Maybe Maria can go ahead.
Well, I agree. I think the interdisciplinary aspect, for example, of feminist economics has really brought an enriched understanding of the role of social norms and particular gender norms in people's behavior. And, for the most part, economics has long neglected this issue of social norms and other dimensions that affect people's behavior. And I sometimes think that we are using 19th century or early 20th century psychology rather than in sort of the way we think about who is this economic agent that make decisions in our economic world. And so I think your point is right. That said, however, each discipline, social science discipline, has its own focus. And so while we address economic issues and economic problems, it's important to see how the social norms, for example, and cultural norms influence people's decision on economic decisions and choices, as well as the constraints, the underlying constraints, for example, women that they face, for example, when they want to participate in the labor market and their choice of employment and so forth. So I think that this enriching of economics by bringing in the wisdom and insights from other disciplines is very important.
Can I, and when I add to that, I think it's also, one has to consider the culture that exists, the intellectual culture that exists within economics itself. There are so many sub-disciplines of economics. If you are working in a topic that you say interdisciplinary topic of integrating everything together, it's extremely challenging because everybody is coming with their own point of view. This is what Keynes was talking about, escaping from the whole old ways of thinking. This is the challenge. It's easy to see new things, but escaping our own thinking from our own perspective is extremely challenging. And so that's the reason why I'm saying, start with, clean state. Don't take existing models and try to increase interdisciplinarity of that model. Completely start thinking from scratch in terms of gender and other inequalities that we have. That's the way I would think about it.
Okay. So there's one fairly straightforward question, and I think maybe Maria, you are best placed to answer this question. Kate Scott asks, where can I learn about feminist macroeconomics? Are there any specific papers, research you recommend? Of course, Raghav, also you can respond to this, but Maria?
Yes, well, thank you for that question. I think, I'd like to invite everyone in this webinar to check our Care Work and the Economy website. It has some of the sort of recent work on engendering macroeconomic models by really prominent and macroeconomists, feminist macroeconomists. And then you can look also at the references because they refer to really seminal works on this area. There's literature that goes way back in the 1990s. In fact, I'd like to mention here the two special issues in World Development in 1995 and 2000 that was produced by the International Working Group on Gender, International Economics and Macroeconomics, these two special issues on world development and engendering macroeconomics. I would encourage you to do that. The work of the people that have produced those articles, as well as the work that we have. And I think there are also some other gender and macro projects that are concurrently taking place, including in the Open University led by Özlem Onaran. There's also, I would encourage people to look at the Gender Budget Group in the UK. The work of the people there have sort of brought in the macro dimensions of fiscal policy, particularly gender budget. So I think there's a lot of good good resources now. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Raghav, do you want to add?
No, that's an exhaustive list.
Okay. I hope, Karen, Kate, that this is satisfactory. I'll make one more attempt. Maria, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? So I think I would like to then, I'm sorry that we're unable to have live questions, but I just wanted to conclude the seminar by saying that this has been really an important conversation to have. And it's so much bigger and broader than just simply, as both of you said, of adding some variable to an existing model and then saying we've engendered. So it's thinking through all of the different dimensions of social and cultural norms that shape our behavior has to be central to any kind of engendering the macroeconomy. And in a way, what it brought back to my mind is that the shirt makers strike in New York, which is what International Women's Day is based on, and to celebrate and memorialize that movement, is that the slogan was, "We want bread. We not only want bread, but we also want roses." And that is essentially what engendering the macroeconomy is about. It's that we want not just the bread, the economic opportunities, but we also want the roses, which is the changed cultural, social norms. And so I hope that all of you who have participated have enjoyed this conversation. I think it's very timely on this particular day, International Women's Day. And thank you for joining this webinar. And Maria and Raghav, thank you so much. Your insights are really, really important. And I hope that we can look towards further insights from you in this very, very challenging area of work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nata. Thank you, Raghav.
Thank you.